Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park historian Jim Ogden stands front-facing in uniform of a tan flat hat, gray shirt, and green trousers. He stands in a large grassy field. Behind him, to his left, is a small stone marker, and a little further to his left is an iron tablet painted blue. In the distance, some ways, is a wooded area.
I hope for many of you all this will be a welcome back, that you have participated in some of the other programs that we have done virtually over the last now almost 3 days to recognize this year's anniversary of the Battle of Chickamauga, the 157th anniversary of the battle. But even if this is the first of these programs that you are watching this year, I do appreciate you tuning in and bringing this program up to help recognize one of the important battles in our nation's terrible yet transformative Civil War. The battle decided. It's still late morning, just midday on Sunday, September the 20th, 1863. There's still many hours of daylight, and as many of you all know, there'll still be much fighting throughout that afternoon. But as we stand here along this rise on the western edge of the Dyer farm fields, we look southeastward across the ground where the Union right, as it was defined on the morning of September the 20th, will collapse. About a mile to the south of us, out of sight through those trees, is a location where the Union Army commander, William Stark Rosecrans, was located in mid-morning on September the 20th. As his troops had been repositioned throughout the overnight hours from the end of the 19th and the early morning hours of the 20th, and then further in the first hours of daylight on the 20th, the location of his headquarters of the previous day, the home of the widow Eliza Glenn, located where the Wilder Brigade Monument is today, had no longer been identified as being tenable as Army headquarters. That rise of ground had actually become a battle position for Sheridan's division. And as Rosecrans rode along his line that morning and ordered the widow Glenn's headquarters closed, he selected an open knoll in the southern portion of the Dyer fields as his command post. Essentially, in many ways, his headquarters would be at that point just in the saddle. And it was there that Rosecrans, after 10:30, would receive the reports which would cause him to issue that ill-considered and incomplete order to Thomas Wood's division that resulted in the opening of an actual gap in his line, Rosecrans thinking that it would fill a reported gap in his line. But as the situation unfolded, when Wood's division, Thomas Wood having checked with Alexander McCook before executing the order, as Wood's division moved and McCook ordered additional troops to take Wood's place, the biggest part of the Confederate Army, troops of the left wing of the Army of Tennessee under James Longstreet, would happen to attack and strike that very point in the line where troops were then in motion. And Longstreet's troops, 3 divisions of which had wound up in a column of 5 lines deep, would pour through that gap in the line and out into the fields of the Dyer farm. And over the next hour's time, there would be fighting in and around these fields as the southern half of the Union line on the battlefield would collapse under the weight of that assault. The lead division of Longstreet's assault column, the provisional division of Bushrod Rush Johnson, with 2 brigades up in the front and 1 brigade in reserve, would come into the fields here and mostly push on westward through the fields, literally between The location of the batteries marked by these commemorative features today on this rise, and where Rosecrans command post was located. Some of those troops, particularly from the reserve brigade of that division, would turn and come in on the flank of this line of 26 Union guns, which extended much further south than just the commemorative features, and begin to roll up that line and capture on this ground 9 of those 26 guns. Subsequently, other of those guns would be captured as they attempt to exit the field. Following the Bushrod Johnson's lead division would come additional troops, and as they poured through the gap in the line, they would begin to turn into the flank of the troops on the north side of the gap in the line, and fighting would develop in the woods across the Dyer field here between troops of Law's division of Longstreet's left wing and John Brannan's division, positioned along the Poe Farm on the west side of the Lafayette Road. Further to the south, south of the gap, the Confederate division commanded by Thomas Carmichael Hindman would attack, and it would move through the woods, driving the Union division under Jefferson Columbus Davis from its position, Davis being flanked on both sides, and Hindman's men would then move out their right, extending into the very southernmost portion of the Dyer fields. And just at that moment, Phil Sheridan's division of Rosecrans' army, which Rosecrans had a few minutes earlier ordered to move from the far right, from the position it had taken up at the site of the Widow Glens, and which Rosecrans had ordered to march across the rear of the army to help deal with the threat on the Union left. Sheridan's division would begin to come over the rise at the south end of the field here and confront Hindman's troops, who are pouring into the south end of the Dyer field. And Sheridan would get 2 of his 3 brigades deployed along the lower slopes of that rise and join the fight. But flanked to the north and struck in front, Hindman's division is going to be able to drive Sheridan's division back as well. And in the collapse of Sheridan's division is the Union Army commander, William Stark Rosecrans. Rosecrans and his command group from their command post had turned out to have the best seat in the house for the disaster which is now befalling his army, largely as a result of that ill-considered order that he had issued at 10:45 that morning. As the Confederates began to pour into the eastern edge of the Dyer field, Rosecrans had ordered his command group to relocate to another point to the northwest. But as the command group began to move in that direction, Rosecrans, in his sleep-deprived and physically and mentally exhausted state, remembered that he had a few minutes earlier ordered Sheridan's division to march from the far right to the far left, and without telling anyone in his command group, Rosecrans turned and rode away from the command group and rode to try to join Sheridan's division and fight with Sheridan. He will indeed reach Sheridan's division, but when Sheridan's 2 brigades, one commanded by William Haynes Lytle until Lytle fell to Confederate fire, and the other by Walworth, the brigade having been Bradley's the day before until Bradley had been wounded in the fighting at Vineyard Farm. Those 2 brigades, despite Sheridan and Rosecrans' efforts, are not able to stem Hindman's attack, particularly when Bushrod Johnson has passed him to the north. And in the collapse of Sheridan's division, Rosecrans will be swept from the field. As this southern half of the Union line begins to become unraveled, not only is Rosecrans going to be swept from the field, but also two of his 3 Corps commanders. Alexander McCook, the 20th Corps commander, and Thomas Crittenden, his 21st Corps commander. Crittenden, by the moment of the breakthrough, had essentially had all of his troops assigned out to either Thomas or McCook. And Crittenden was in many ways a man then without a command. Here, more towards the northern end of the dire field, there will be a fighting withdrawal by Brannan's division. Even though John Brannan's men are going to be flanked by troops of Longstreet's assault, pouring through the gap and turning into their southern flank, Brannan, and particularly his brigades under Connell and Cruxton, are going to be able to put up some resistance, and in the end, buy some time, cost the Confederates some organization as they attempt to crush the Union right. Brannan's men will fall back, fighting out of the woods across the dire field there, being pushed northwestward by the Confederates of Henry L. Benning, Law's Alabama Brigade, and Robertson's Texas Brigade. Robertson's Texas Brigade will come out into these fields and, moving in pursuit of the withdrawing Federals, will move to the very north end of the field, when they themselves will suffer a Union counterattack and be driven back. And the commander of those 3 Confederate divisions that had wound up stacked in 5 lines, one behind the other, what becomes known as Longstreet's assault column, that commander, John Bell Hood, riding out into the field here, seeing his old division, old brigade, the Texas Brigade that had earned him such fame in the Virginia theater, being driven back. Hood will ride in amongst those Texas troops to try to rally them, and as he does, John Bell Hood will be struck in the right leg, a minie ball entering the outside of his right leg, passing through the middle third of his right femur, shattering it into multiple pieces, and then the minie ball exiting the upper interior portion of his right thigh. Hood's left arm, still only partially recovered from his wound received at Gettysburg, is in a sling across his chest, and now Longstreet's immediate subordinate and commander of these 3 divisions will go down with a serious wound to his right leg. He'll be caught by some of his escort and staff and lowered to the ground, placed on a litter, and carried to the rear. And the seriousness of this wound is such that it will necessitate the amputation of his right leg close to his hip, and leave Hood in that disfigured form that he'll be as the commander of this Confederate Army, the Army of Tennessee, between July of 1864 and January of 1865. The Union guns that had been captured up here will be claimed by multiple Confederate units who successively come on to this ground. But in a little more than an hour's time, the Confederates will drive the Union right from their positions on the field, put most of the Union right into a very fluid state, driving them to the west and northwest, but with the majority of the Union troops knowing that they were trying to get back to Chattanooga, still to our north, these Union troops will begin turning northward in the hills of Missionary Ridge and fleeing or moving back towards Chattanooga. Although many of them, including much of Sheridan's division and Jefferson Davis's division, will rally and reorganize and play a role in the closing scenes of the battle late on the 20th. But this turn of Union troops to the north, the fighting withdrawal of Brannan's division northwestward under the weight of the Confederate flanking or coming in on their flank, will also turn the Confederate troops northward as well. Bragg's original plan had hoped that the Confederates would be driving the Union troops southwestward into McLemore's Cove. But now, while the Union right has collapsed and Confederates have many signs of a victory on the field in the form of prisoners and abandoned Union equipment, captured cannon, captured ordnance wagons, and other materiel, the Confederates are now only pushing the Union troops back towards Chattanooga. And unbeknownst to them, and even unbeknownst to many of the Union troops, they are winding up pushing the Union troops back onto some very strong defensive terrain. As might be suggested by this rise, where this line of Union guns had been positioned that morning, the ground here on the western edge of what had become the scene of the Battle of Chickamauga began to rise. And even more so, a little bit to the north of us. In these woods just to the north is a series of mostly wooded hills or knolls. And those rises are in the way of many of those retreating Union troops and get recognized as a potential defensive position. And Union troops will begin to rally and make a stand. And the senior Union officer left on the battlefield, George Thomas, will get credit for that stand, and that stand on Snodgrass Hill, repulsing repeated Confederate attacks throughout the afternoon, will allow Thomas late that day to withdraw the Union troops back towards Chattanooga. This does become a Confederate victory, but not a victory as Bragg had planned, a victory that instead has pushed the Union Army back into Chattanooga. But what decides the Battle of Chickamauga is the action that occurred on the ground here in the southern half of the Union line on September the 20th, 1863.
Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park historian Jim Ogden stands, front-facing in uniform of a tan flat hat, gray shirt, and green trousers. He is standing in a wooded area on the downhill portion of a slight ridge several yards away, while making his way up the ridge to the crest.
Soldiers being driven across this ground, some artillery pieces as well, including some of the guns that had been on that 26-gun line, are driven through into these woods as well and onto this rising ground. But as they work their way up the slope of this hill, many of them begin to recognize that this rising ground potentially is going to provide them an opportunity to make a stand and resist the pursuing Confederates. Federal soldiers work their way towards the crest of the rise, and recognizing that there are men here who still have will to fight. Some units arrive up here as little knots of men that have retained their position around their colors. Charles Harker's brigade, which had counterattacked in the north end of the Dyer Field, arrives up here largely intact. And from these various pieces, a new line begins to be formed. Now, the senior Union officer left on the battlefield, George Thomas, is going to get the credit for making this stand on Snodgrass Hill. But when these first Union troops began to rally and take up positions on the tops of these rises, which collectively are known as Snodgrass Hill or Horseshoe Ridge, a spur of Missionary Ridge, George Thomas was not then here yet. And yes, there are some generals up here, like John Brannan. There are lots of colonels, like Moses Walker and John Cruxton, Cruxton being one of Brannan's brigade commanders. He had even been wounded in the fighting withdrawal up here, but he stays for a time, rallying his men and continuing to direct them. Moses Walker was one of the regular brigade commanders within Brannan's division, but at this particular time he is awaiting a court of inquiry into some of his conduct. But so solicitous is he of his soldiers' needs that he has not remained in Chattanooga or back at Bridgeport or Stevenson or Tullahoma or Murfreesboro or Nashville. He has remained with the Army, and he had served Brannan essentially as an aide on the battlefield. And now in this moment of crisis, as the Union right is collapsing, as Brannan's division is being driven from the field, Moses Walker will ride in amongst the troops, including men of the brigade with which he is normally associated, under Commander John Connell here, and he'll begin to rally those men. He was respected by those soldiers, and they'll respond to his calls to rally and form a line. But while there are officers that are helping to form this line, as much as anything, this Union line that will form on the crest of Snodgrass Hill, a Union line that begins on the open spur out to the east of the buildings of the Snodgrass farmstead, and then runs along the crest of the open spur, and then up to the knoll south of the Snodgrass cabin, and then westward over the top of this, the highest rise in the complex, and then on westward. As much as anything, the Union troops who rally and make a stand here are rallied by men who emerge from the ranks as natural leaders, who recognize that this ground can be defended. Most of the Union line is in open woods. In fact, in this area, the woods are so open that one Union officer would suggest that you could see 400 yards down through the woods. He said when he was along that position that the attacking Confederates were clearly evident at a great distance as they advanced towards him. The brief counterattack made by Harker's brigade in the north end of the Dyer Field had bought, as it turned out, about 30 critical minutes' time for this stand to be made. As these Union troops had rallied, they realized that Confederate pursuit was not immediately behind them, and that they would have a minute to get organized, and they do. And when the Confederates come up in pursuit, the lead Confederate brigade at that time being the South Carolina Brigade under Joseph Kershaw, that large brigade, uniformed in Richmond Depot clothing, waist-length jackets made out of blue-gray English Army cloth, and wearing light blue trousers, which at a distance caused them to be mistaken as Union troops by Harker's men in the Dyer Field. Kershaw's South Carolina Brigade coming forward. The whole vast mass moved as if by a single mind, one Union observer would say, will move forward and will be the first to strike this rallied Union line. That large South Carolina brigade, its left extending over to come up the slopes of the next knoll or rise in this complex. Other South Carolinians coming up this slope that we are on now. The brigade marker being here as well. The South Carolinians will charge up this slope They had been in the fifth line of the assault column and had moved into the dire fields and had seen the wreckage of the Union right. The only Union troops they had faced in the field had disappeared in front of them. For them, amongst all of the Confederates, was the sense that the day was won, that victory was theirs. They initially cannot believe that there is anything that is a solid Union line on the top of this hill. And they work their way up this slope only to be blasted by a halt, or to a halt, by the volleys fired by rallied Union troops on the crest of these rise. They will go back and reorganize and try it a second time and a third time, being the first of, in the end, 25 individual Confederate assaults against this rallied line on Snodgrass Hill. For George Thomas, when he arrived and found the troops who have made a stand here, he will encourage those men and then have the added benefit of, fortuitously, about 2 o'clock, the 2 brigades of Gordon Granger's Reserve Corps will arrive from their position up near Rossville Gap in Missionary Ridge and will arrive just in time to be used by Thomas to extend the Union line another half mile to the west to protect the right flank of the initial line and to turn back Confederates who were threatening that flank. And throughout that afternoon, this mile-long Union line, facing just a little bit east of south, will throw back one after another of those Confederate assaults. Up this ground, or up this slope that we stand on now, 6 times Confederates would attack, and 6 times they would be driven back by Union troops. Some additional Union troops will arrive as well to support the line. Ferdinand Vanderveer's brigade, which had participated in the fighting in the north end of the Kelly Field that morning, will come over in the afternoon. Some troops taken from various positions along the Kelly Field line will come as well. But in late afternoon, George Thomas, recognizing that while these troops have made a stand and the Kelly Field line still holds on, that there is a half-mile gap between the 2 lines, never closed by anything more than a heavy line of skirmishers of Villick's brigade, and that the Union line has potentially vulnerable flanks. And responding to an order from William Stark Rosecrans, Thomas will begin a phased withdrawal from the battlefield, dropping back first 1 brigade and then another from both the Kelly Field and the Snodgrass Hill Horseshoe Ridge line, passing them off to the northwest towards and through McFarland Gap and back towards Chattanooga. As darkness approaches, seemingly coming earlier because of the smoke in the trees from the discharge of all of the weapons and another brush fire on the battlefield on this slope, the last of the Union troops prepare to withdraw from the battlefield. And the Confederates finally achieve the coordination, cooperation, synchronization that they have needed really over the last 3 days and launch an all-out assault. And Confederate soldiers will come charging up to the log works around the Kelly Field position and up the slopes of Snodgrass Hill one more time. And except for a couple of Union regiments that had not gotten the orders proper about withdrawing, the Union troops, or Confederate troops, will find the Union positions largely abandoned. And Confederates will occupy the Union positions around Kelly Field and along the Lafayette Road there and here on the crest of Snodgrass Hill. They've seemingly won a great victory. They sense that and cheer for some time after dark. But the Union Army has withdrawn towards Chattanooga. It is a Confederate victory on the battlefield, but Braxton Bragg must now pursue, exploit, and follow up. But he's fought his army over the last 3 days and has suffered 18,000 casualties amongst his 66,000 men engaged, and thousands more soldiers have simply dropped out from exhaustion, and others have taken wounded comrades to the rear. The number of men in the ranks at the end of the battle for Bragg is very small. The inability of Bragg to pursue will allow Rosecrans, Thomas, McCook, and Crittenden to begin reorganizing their troops, first at Rossville Gap and across Chattanooga Valley between Rossville Gap and Lookout Mountain, and then in fortifications being constructed around Chattanooga. And the campaign for Chattanooga will continue. But its largest, costliest battle had been fought on this ground on that Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, September 18, 19, and 20, 1863.
The pictures shown in this video are described as follows. Image number 1, a black and white photo of Union General Thomas J. Wood standing, forward-facing but slightly turned, prematurely balding with dark hair and full dark mustache and a small section of dark hair on his chin, wearing a dark blue Union General's coat with gold epaulets on the shoulders and one row of brass buttons down the front. A black leather belt and brass buckle are worn around the waist. Image number 2, a black and white photo of Confederate General Bushrod Johnson seated, prematurely balding with dark hair combed back and full dark mustache, wearing a light gray Confederate general's coat with general's insignia of 3 stars within a wreath on the collar and 2 rows of brass buttons down the front. Image number 3, a black and white photo of Confederate General Thomas Hindman seated with long dark hair combed back and full dark beard, wearing a light gray Confederate general's coat with general's insignia of 3 stars within a wreath on the collar and 1 row of brass buttons down the front with only the top button buttoned. Image number 4, a black and white photo of Union General Jefferson C. Davis seated with full dark hair swooped to the left and a full dark goatee, wearing a dark blue Union General's coat with 2-star insignia of a Major General on the shoulder and 2 rows of brass buttons down the front with 2 buttons unbuttoned. Image number 5, a black and white photo of Union General Philip Sheridan seated and leaning on his right elbow while his head is turned at an angle, with dark hair and a dark handlebar mustache, wearing a dark blue Union General's coat with 2-star insignia of a Major General on the shoulder and 2 rows of brass buttons buttoned down the front. Image number 6, a black and white photo of Union General William H. Lytle seated, front-facing and slightly turned, with hands in white gloves resting in his lap, with dark hair combed to the left and a dark, full, long beard, wearing a dark blue Union General's coat with 1-star insignia of a Brigadier General on the shoulder and 2 rows of brass buttons buttoned down the front. Image number 7, a black and white photo of Union General Alexander McDowell McCook seated in a profile position in a chair with dark hair combed to the right and a dark mustache, wearing a dark blue Union General's coat with 2-star insignia of a Major General on the shoulder and 2 rows of brass buttons buttoned down the front. Image number 8, a black and white photo of Union General Thomas Crittenden standing, front-facing, with head turned slightly to the right, with dark hair combed to the right and a full dark goatee, wearing a dark blue Union General's coat with 2-star insignia of a Major General on the shoulder and 2 rows of brass buttons buttoned down the front. Image number 9, a black and white photo of Confederate General John Bell Hood seated and slightly turned, with full dark hair combed backward and a full dark beard, wearing a light gray Confederate officer's coat with 3 stars on the collar and 2 rows of brass buttons down the front. Image number 10, a black and white photo of Union General John Brannan seated, front facing and slightly turned with left hand on hip and right hand on his lap, with dark hair combed to the left and a dark beard with a handlebar mustache, wearing a dark blue Union general's coat with 1-star insignia of a brigadier general on the shoulder and 2 rows of brass buttons buttoned down the front. Image number 11, a black and white photo of Union Colonel John Croxton, seated, body slightly turned and face forward, with long dark hair combed to the left and a dark beard, wearing a dark blue Union officer's coat with gold eagle insignia of a colonel on the shoulder and 2 rows of brass buttons unbuttoned down the front. Image number 12, a black and white photo of Confederate General Joseph Kershaw, seated, forward-facing, with short dark hair combed to the left and full mustache, wearing a light gray Confederate general's coat with general's insignia of 3 stars within a wreath on the collar and 2 rows of brass buttons buttoned down the front.